Greetings, audiophiles and Mass Effect fans. Welcome to my reading of my fanfiction, After the Fall. This is a Mass Effect fanfiction, and as such, most of the characters and the universe belong to BioWare/EA Games. No copyright infringement is intended. However, the scenario and occurrences within this fanfiction are my intellectual property, so if you decide you want to share this with someone, credit me. Please. Part 3. Vakarian.
Shepard.
It took seconds for Garrus to reach her, even though he was making his way on crutches. He flung them aside and threw his arms around her. They were a tangle of blankets and limbs as they clung to each other like two bodies floating in space, terrified to lose one another in the icy blackness. He buried his face in her neck, and she felt his warm, familiar breath. Pain lanced through every part of her, but she didn't care. She was crying again, but these tears were different than the ones she had shed when Kaidan carried her to safety. These were tears of pure joy. "I almost thought the galaxy had gotten a lot emptier," Garrus said, his voice muffled by her neck. His lips tickled. "I didn't want to get to the bar too early," she answered, finally pushing him back and looking him over. He looked a little worse for wear, but nothing compared to when he had had half his face shot off on Omega. Obviously, there were the crutches, but she saw no grave injuries. He seemed to take her in as well, with deep love in his eyes. It was clear he never intended to let her out of his sight again. Nearby, the nurse made tutting sounds, but it was obvious she had tried and failed to keep the Turian from his mate's side. She would have no hope of removing him from his spot on the bed, arms wrapped around Shepard. Their lips met. Garrus had gotten a lot better at kissing in their time together. It wasn't something that Turians did, they were more for nuzzling and the odd forehead-to-forehead moment. His lips felt so warm and welcome. She didn't even notice the cuts on her own lips when they protested. When the two came up for air, Garrus put his forehead against hers and moved to stroke her hair, as he had always done. Then he sat back in surprise. "What?" she asked, giggling at the expression on his face. "Is my nose really that bad? Joker told me it was crooked now." "No, it's not that. He seemed nervous about telling her. "What?" she snapped. He knew that tone of voice and didn't dare keep mum. "It looks like they had to cut off your hair." "Huh?" She raised her good arm, but even then the shoulder was so stiff she almost couldn't touch the back of her head. Sure enough, her black hair was cut close to the scalp. She had had glorious hair that fell straight as an arrow to her butt. She always kept it up in a bun when on duty, but Garrus had been enthralled with it when she let it fall free. She felt a little sad. She had always liked her hair. "I'm sorry," said the Asari nurse, who did look apologetic. "We had to stitch some of the wounds on your head, and it was best just to cut your hair." "I understand." Shepard let her hands fall into her lap, where Garrus scooped them up at once. He took several moments to kiss each of her fingers in turn before giving her a playful smile. "I guess I'll have to leave you. Your hair was the only reason I was hanging around." She chuckled. It made her ribs ache, and he must have seen her wince, because he made a sympathetic sound, then scooted all the way onto the bed and gathered her into his arms. Her body protested, but she mentally told it to fuck off. "Never again," she whispered, nestling her cheek against his chest. He asked, snuggling into a more comfortable position. Her mind went back to that moment on Earth. A Mako had been thrown by the Reaper beam weapon. She and her team had managed to dodge, but the Mako had sprayed boiling fuel onto Liara and Garrus. Liara was burned, but Garrus took the worst of it. Joker had risked it all to bring the Normandy in for an evac, as well as to drop off fresh troops. Shepard had instructed Liara to take Garrus up the gangway to safety. He had refused to go until Shepard had told him that she loved him. Love. She'd never felt anything quite like she felt for Garrus. A longing, binding, wild, tame, freeing, all-encompassing feeling. "I'm never leaving you like that again," she said. "Good," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "You're marrying me, Garrus Vakarian." "Am I?" She could tell he was smiling without having to look at his face. "That's a human tradition, right? To publicly celebrate the joining of two people? Turians don't have anything like that." When you choose your life mate, you just tell all your friends and family, and they congratulate you, and that's all. Do you want a big party? No, once I get back on my feet, and then back on my ship, we'll get married there. I always knew I'd wed on my ship. I'll see if Hackett can do the ceremony, though I expect Tally would do just as well. Sounds exciting, Garrus said, gently arranging her IV tube so he wouldn't bump it. I'll keep my last name, of course, she chuckled. Shepard. It wasn't even her real last name. She didn't know what her true name was. She'd been a small child on the streets of Earth, scraping by and trying to survive. One night she'd fallen asleep in a crate that had once held apples. She liked the smell. The next morning a teenage boy wearing a red neckerchief had fished her out. She didn't know it then, but she was being recruited into the Reds. They'd noticed her, how tough she was, surviving on her own the way she did, fighting off dogs for scraps of food. The boy had asked her for her name, and she told him that she didn't have one. He'd shrugged, then looked at the box she'd been sleeping in. Shepard Valley Apples was stamped on the side. Later, she chose her first name, Lorelei, after a movie star she liked. That Lorelei had been tall, slim, glamorous, and most of all, dangerous. She always played the role of the badass, the woman in charge. Even then, young Lorelei Shepard had had a leader's mind and a warrior's soul. Of course, then she could never have guessed that she would grow up to save the galaxy. Or at least, try to save the galaxy. Even nestled in Garrus' arms, she couldn't quite shake something, a strange notion that it wasn't over. At first she had assumed it was the PTSD talking, but there were drugs for that. Could it be some kind of instinct? Should I change my name to yours? Garrus asked, startling her from her reverie. What does human tradition dictate? No, I don't think you should, she said, smiling. She tilted her head and kissed him on the lips again. After all, there's no Shepard without Vakarian.